Welcome. Thank you for joining me. We're going to look at how to write a results section for your research article. So let's get started. Before we get started, I really want you to avoid the trap of using the results section as a dumping ground of data and hoping that the reader can make sense of it themselves and see its significance. It's very unlikely that the reader will do so. Your role in the results section is to guide them through it. Remember how the results section fits in within your scientific argument. What you're doing in the introduction is you're proposing an idea, a theory, a concept that you're trying to test. In the methods section, you describe how you're testing that idea. And in the results section, what you're doing is you're making your case. You're justifying your reasoning with evidence. And so you want to remind your reader of the ideas that you're testing. You want to describe what you found, and you want to explain what your findings mean so that they're able to see, yes, the data support the ideas that you're coming across. So a common challenge, as I mentioned, is that the results sections often come across as dumping grounds. They may look just like data output, and it makes it really difficult for the reader to make sense of your findings. So what you really want to do is walk the reader through your findings. You want to provide a narrative that helps them interpret what these findings mean. So there isn't an exact formula for writing a strong research section, but choosing chosen mentor texts and articles from the journals that you're planning on submitting to will help you with structuring it. But there are general guiding principles that I'll walk you through. Let's take a look. Have you ever been to a museum and had a docent basically guide you through what you're seeing in the museum? That's what you want the results section to be. You want to guide them through your data and tell them a story. So it's critical for your results section to have strong planning. So you want to make sure that your results section answers your research questions. And you also want to plan in advance to figure out the story that you're going to tell. So one of the strategies that I'd recommend is to start with planning and plan very carefully. You'll start by listing your research questions so you'll remember what you're trying to address and what you're trying to answer. And the next step is creating tables and figures that answer each of the questions. That enables you to see what story is there in the data, what are your data telling you, and you'll organize your tables and figures in a way that best tells your story. The next step that I'd recommend is to create captions for each of your tables and your figures. And these are just drafts. You can revise them as you go through. But when you're drafting your captions, you want to make them self-contained so that if a reader just skims through your results section, they'll be able to get the gist of your main point and main findings just by looking at these tables and figures. Terrific, you've figured out the story you want to tell, you've got your figures, your tables done. Now you're ready to start drafting your results section. And I would recommend using a two-part structure for the results section. The first part sets up the reader to prepare them for your results, and the second part is the story you're telling with your data. So you've just finished planning for your results section. Now is the time to start drafting it. You've got all your tables and figures and you're probably raring to go, but wait, first you've got to start with the setup. So the goal of the setup is to introduce the reader to your data. What you want to do is show that your data is trustworthy, how have you treated the data, and how will your data be able to answer your research questions? This is kind of like the scroll that you see at the beginning of movies where they're not telling the story, but they're setting the picture, providing information about the landscape of the story. So what you provide here would be, for example, if you created an intervention, that you'll provide information about the treatment and the control groups. Did they in fact receive different instruction? What was the fidelity of implementation? Were the groups similar at pre-test? Were there comparable attrition rates? So you're providing information about the data surrounding your intervention and the quality of implementing the intervention itself. If you're using a large data set as your data source, then you provide descriptive statistics of your sample. How might they differ from those of the larger data set as a whole? What are the characteristics of this population? How did you treat the data? If you have a qualitative study, you'll provide background information that's critical for contextualizing your findings, but they don't necessarily tell the story that you want to tell. If there are any analytic procedures that you might have used that you didn't provide a lot of detail about in the methods section, you'll provide that information here. So with the setup, you're basically showing the reader what you did, what the data are like, so that way they know that you are actually able to answer your research questions. You've got your setup done, you've got your tables and figures ready to go. It can be really tempting to just jump right into the story and present all your data. But one of the things that you want to keep in mind is that you're telling a story. So when you present your data, when you present your findings, you really want to make sure that the reader can understand how your findings are connected to your study goals, to the theory, the practice, the policy implications that you're setting. So here are some tips to help you tell your story. The first is that you want to move from the most important findings to the less important findings. You don't want to have a big reveal at the end. You want to start and lead with your strongest points. When you discuss each research question and overall, what you want to do is establish your main point and then elaborate. So for example, you want to present your central point, and then you'll talk about how things might diverge, either through mediators or moderators, qualifiers, nuanced differences, but it's much easier for the reader to understand what these qualifiers and changes may be and variations on the central point when they first understand the central point. Using subheadings and paragraph breaks can also help the reader process and read your results section so that it makes more sense to them. So using subheadings such as the research questions themselves can help organize the results section so your story comes through. Short paragraphs that are each focused on a single point is easier for the reader to understand than a long paragraph with tons of important details in. So try and keep the paragraphs short and focused. And finally, don't forget that the goal of the results section is to tell your story and how the evidence that you get from your findings support the claims that you're testing that you presented in the introduction. So you want to use the remind, describe, explain method to help them see the connections. So you'll remind your reader of the research questions for the statements such as, first we wished to address issue number B. Then you'll describe and report how you tested it in a single sentence or clause. And finally, you'll explain what you found. And rather than just saying there was a significant difference between the two groups, you might explain whether one group outperformed another group, why that might be. So you're telling your story here, but you're connecting your story to your study aims and the methods you've used. As I noted earlier, there's no one-size-fits-all approach to writing a results section, and there are some critical elements to include based on the design that you've used. So let's take a look at the APA Journal Article Reporting Standards for qualitative studies. And these are the JARS or Journal Article Reporting Standards specific to the results section of qualitative studies. So one thing that you're going to want to be sure is to describe your research findings such as themes, categories, or narratives, and the meaning and understanding that the researcher has derived from the data analysis. You're going to demonstrate the analytic process of reaching your findings, such as quotes or excerpts from data. You'll present research findings in a way that's compatible with the study design that you've used. It is helpful to present synthesizing illustrations such as diagrams, tables, or model, only if it's useful in organizing and conveying your findings. Similarly, photographs or links to videos can be used in qualitative research, but again, use them only if they help clarify your findings. And in using photographs or links, then again, you want to make sure that they're aligned with protections of the participants. Findings may be presented in an artistic manner, such as links to dramatic presentations of findings, but they should also include information in the reporting standards to support the research presentation. Again, you want it to be clear that what you present is aligned with the qualitative methods that you've used. It also is valuable to use quotes or excerpts to augment your data description, such as thick, evocative description, field notes, text excerpts, but they shouldn't replace the description of the findings of the analysis. The remaining slides are for the JARS for quantitative studies. So if you're not doing quantitative research, then I hope you have a terrific day. If you're doing quantitative research, why don't you bear with me a little longer as we go through the journal article reporting standards. One of the things that's essential in your article is to have information about the flow of participants. So how many participants were in each group at each stage of the study? What was the flow of participants through each stage of the study? While this may be in the method section, if there are changes that are meaningful, then you'll want to include them in your results section. Similarly, in the methods section, you may be including information about the recruitment. And if that hasn't been reported there, then you'll again want to ensure that if it's not in the methods section, in the results section you have key information about recruitment, such as dates defining periods of recruitment and repeated measures or follow-up. Let's take a look at some of the statistics and data analysis that you'll be reporting according to JARS standards in the results section. For the missing data, if you haven't included this in the method section, again, you'll report the frequency or percentage of missing data. And then you'll also put a justification for how you treated that missing data. So were the data missing completely at random, missing at random, not missing at random, or how you addressed it. So if you used imputation, if you used list-wise deletion, you'll provide a rationale in your results section, not just for how the data were missing, but how you treated the missing data. You'll also provide a description of each of the primary and secondary outcomes, including the total sample for each subgroup, and that includes the number of cells, case means, standard deviations, and other measures that characterize the data used. So you want to make sure that your tables are complete and have both means and standard deviations, if relevant. Sometimes you'll include ranges. What you'll do is you'll provide all the necessary information. For inferential statistics, you'll report the results of all inferential tests conducted, not just with the exact p-values if null hypothesis testing was used, but also reporting the minimally sufficient set of statistics, such as degrees freedoms, mean squares effect, mean square error. So you're going to provide the full information. So if you conducted a t-test, then you'll also provide degrees freedom and t-values. You'll include effect size estimates and confidence intervals on estimates that correspond to each of the inferential tests conducted when possible. And finally, there'll be a clear differentiation between the primary hypotheses and their tests and exploratory hypotheses. In other words, you want to be clear which of your findings are based on hypothesis testing and which ones are exploratory. The next step is for complex data analyses, such as structural equation modeling, HLM, factor analysis, multivariate analyses. Now, this isn't stating that you must do complex data analysis. You should do the analyses that are appropriate for the data that you have. But if you do complex data analysis, then you want to provide details of the models that you've estimated. Similarly, you will be reporting the variance, covariance, or correlation matrices. And then it's also important to identify the statistical software that you used to run the analyses, such as SAS Proc GLM or a particular R package. That's because there have been found to be some variations based on the software that you use. You'll also report whether or not there are any problems with estimation. So if you're doing a SEM model and it fails to converge, or you have a bad solution space, you'll report that. You'll report regression diagnostics, was there an issue with multicollinearity, or any analytic anomalies that were detected in solutions that you used to those problems. You may not have experience any of the estimation problems. So then you won't report anything. Other data analyses performed, such as adjusted analyses, would be presented, and you'd indicate that those were planned, or you would indicate which ones weren't planned. So this might not necessarily be in the level of primary data analysis, but if you had conducted any analyses that were adjusted, then you'll report them as well. And finally, you'll report any problems with any of the statistical assumptions or data distributions that could affect the validity of your findings. We're going to end today looking at the JARS standards for experimental manipulation studies. And this information will all likely go up in the setup portion of your paper. In other words, you'll be providing this information to demonstrate the trustworthiness of your manipulation and your experiment. So you'll include information about the participant flow. So you'll report the total number of groups if the experimental manipulation was administered at the group level, so a between subject design, and the number of participants assigned to each group. In this, you'll include the number of participants who were approached for inclusion or were recruited, the number of participants who began the study, so how many began, number of participants who did not complete the experiment or they crossed over to other conditions as the reasons why. So this is your attrition. How many people left the study and why? So it could be simply because it was a year-long study and students switched schools or they switched classes at the semester break, but you'll provide the reasons why. And this way it will show whether or not there was differential attrition between your treatment and control and the reasons for that attrition. Finally, you'll report the number of participants who are actually included in your primary analyses. In your setup, you'll also provide information of the treatment fidelity. Was the experimental manipulation implemented as intended? Was there carryover or contamination effects cross conditions? So were control teachers starting to use some of the things that the experimental teachers were doing? You'll provide that information. Similarly, you'll provide baseline data or pretest data. That provides information about the baseline demographic and clinical characteristics of your groups. Finally, you'll report whether or not there were any adverse events or side effects. If there weren't any, you don't have to report anything. You just say that there were no adverse effects. So now you have all you need to make sure that your results section adheres to the APA JARS standards.